Again, is Gwen Ragsdale, and I'm the Executive Director of the Lest We Forget Museum of Slavery. We are the only museum of slavery dedicated to telling the story of the transatlantic slave trade that's known as slavery, all right? The transatlantic slave trade was the largest migration, or I should say forced migration of Africans in the history of America. Yes, even larger than the forced migration of the indigenous people. It's important that we share this information, and better yet, know this information, so that we can better understand how we can maneuver in today's society. Now, as the person who introduced me said, we started out as a small little collection. My husband, J. Justin Ragsdale, has been collecting slavery artifacts for over 60 years. He was always interested in this period of history, but particularly interested because he wanted to know how our people got here. It wasn't something that he learned in school or even in the books that he read. He was quite a voracious reader. However, he had a very unique opportunity. Even though he grew up here in Philadelphia, his family used to send him south to spend time with his great uncle, whose name was Uncle Bub. Uncle Bub lived in a place called Rock Hill, South Carolina. And he loved visiting Uncle Bub. He said Joey was, which his uncle called him, was the kind of kid that realized at an early age that it was the elders that had all the information. And he loved the stories that his Uncle Bub told him. Uncle Bub would talk about what his life was like coming up in the Jim Crow era. And you know, the Jim Crow era followed the emancipation of slavery, but laws and legislation were created to just continue to keep them oppressed. But whenever Uncle Bub would tell him his stories, he kept referring to this man who he called Massa. He talked about Massa all the time. He would say Massa this and Massa that. For a while, my husband thought that was the man's first name, until he realized that because of Uncle Bub's heavy southern accent, that he was saying master. All right? One of the stories kind of stuck with him. He said, Massa took me off to the war and made me a soldier when I was just a boy. Now, for some reason, he said that story kind of stuck in his head, and it would have great relevance later on. And by the way, that is oral history. In many cases, that's all we have is oral history. So if you have stories that you have been passing down from generation to generation, that's your family history, and it's so important to keep it going, because this history is going to go away, or going away, or at risk of going away, which I'm very fearful of. But anyway, Uncle Bub also kept a trunk in the rear room of his house. But every time my husband asked him about it or go here, he would shift him away. And he said he was so fascinated by this trunk that sometimes when Uncle Bub wasn't watching or wasn't around, he would hit the lock on the trunk, hoping maybe the top would fly open, but of course it never did. Uncle Bub, first of all, lived to be 109 years old, which is really quite remarkable, but not that unusual. I'm sure you've heard of Black Wall Street before, right? But do you know up until 3 years ago, there were still 3 living survivors of Black Wall Street, 2 of which were a brother and sister. The sister is now 110, and her baby brother just died 2 years ago at 102, and there's still one other living lady who's now 107. Now this speaks to the fact that there's having some mighty strong people to live so long coming up in such oppressive times, which as an African American gives me hope, gives me a feeling of I too can overcome. We all can overcome. So anyway, after Uncle Bub died, my husband decided to return to Rock Hill to see if he could find a house that he had spent so many fond memories with his Uncle Bub. But he had a hard time finding the house at first because a tree had actually fallen over on it. And tree branches and everything were going out of the windows. But because he was familiar with the area, he was able to locate the house. Now, once he got inside the house, what do you think the first thing he looked for was? The trunk. Now, if you visit the museum, you'll be able to see that trunk. When my husband got in that house, the first thing he looked for was that trunk, as I said. He pulled it out, pried it open, which wasn't very difficult to do because the weather had gotten to it. As soon as he opened the trunk, the first thing he noticed in the trunk was a small plow. I asked my husband, why in heaven's name would your uncle have a plow in his trunk? He says he remembers his Uncle Bub telling him that when he was a young man, he used to lease himself out to the white farmers in the area to plow small portions of their land. He said he had an old mule for a while, but when that old mule died, Uncle Bub said he would put that harness on his back and plow that land with the strength of his own body. Now that not only speaks to Uncle Bub's strength, but it also speaks to the fact that Uncle Bub was an entrepreneur. He made a way out of no way. And in fact, to be perfectly honest with you, entrepreneurship still runs very deep in the Ragsdale clan, all right? So anyway, he keeps digging around in that trunk, and all of a sudden he hits something hard, and it was a chain. And that chain was attached to a shackle. He didn't know it then, and he started realizing because of his reading and following up on these things, he realized it was a shackle later on. Now this shackle is very unusual. We don't bring that shackle out. It's our prime piece. You have to come to the museum to see it, but I'll try and describe it to you. It's a shackle that has an iron collar that would sit on the neck of an enslaved male. Most of your really harsh shackles were used on the males, all right? But inside that shackle was a leather collar. Now, at first we said, well, maybe that's to give some comfort to the enslaved person. Not at all. Remember, enslaved Africans were considered property. And if he was all dinged up and marked up, he would lose value. So it was really for the slaver's use, all right? We did a DNA test on that leather collar and found human DNA on it. Mm-hmm. Now, we have not been able to trace it back to Ragsdale DNA, and there could be two reasons for it. Perhaps Uncle Bub was not forced to wear it, which is a good thing, or maybe Uncle Bub was not an actual biological family member. Remember, our families were split up. Children sold away, grandchildren sold away. But my husband grew up with his mother telling him that was her uncle. So as far as he was concerned, that was his great uncle. So anyway, he keeps digging around. Oh, let me finish describing that shackle to you. So anyway, hanging from that iron collar is a long chain about 12 inches long, all right? Now, that in and of itself is about 12 to 15 pounds, all right? At the end of that long chain is a 40-pound ball. Now, again, remember, this shackle is fitted on the neck of an enslaved male. He wouldn't be holding it, of course, because his arms would be shackled behind his back. He would be shackled at the wrists. That 40-pound ball would hang and hit him in a critical area that would slow him down, if not stop him from running away. Now, it was that shackle that inspired my husband to want to collect more slave shackles. He started collecting these shackles. He traveled all over the world, quite frankly, and the country, looking for iron shackles. That was his interest because of what he found in his uncle's trunk. Now, interestingly enough, my husband traveled to Africa several times, even had a business there for a while. However, do you know where most of the shackles were found? What do you think? Here in America, where we were brought, all right? He always traveled the dirt roads, back roads. He would always go to these places, little antique shops, or where they would have garage sales or whatever. And he was bold. He would walk in, look around, and finally he would go to the proprietor. He said, "You got the iron shackles?" At first they were kind of taken back until they said, "Come here." And they would go and dig in the back. They would pull out some things. He also had hooked up with a band of collectors who were going and finding artifacts on the former Civil War battlefield. Now, my husband was a fair-skinned man. He had green eyes. And when he was young, he had big, red, curly hair. He has no curls now, by the way, no hair. All right? And he hooked up with these group of white collectors who taught him how to find artifacts. In fact, his first metal detector was given to him by one of those people. And he read the book that whenever the Confederates wanted to, let me slow myself down, sorry. Whenever they wanted to hide things, they always hid it in outhouses, all right? So he would start waving this wand under real grassy knolls, where perhaps an outhouse sat. Found some things that way. But one time he said he was in he called it a barn, and he realized it may have been more like maybe even a slave shack. And one of the white guys said to him, "Hey, Joey, you seem real interested in all of these iron objects. Here's a horse bridle," and threw it at my husband. When he looked at it, it wasn't a horse bridle, but an actual slave shackle. All right? So anyway, that's what started his quest. We have been told by the Smithsonian that we may have the most extensive collection of slavery artifacts. At first we were told on the East Coast, but now we suspect that it may be the United States, because that was his collection. Of course we have other things, but the shackles really tell the story of how people who look like me and many of you came to America, all right? So unless you can trace your roots back to the indigenous people, we came from America, we came from Africa, and many of us were enslaved, all right? Now, getting back to the transatlantic slave trade, which was very, very harrowing. Do you know that the transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration of people in the United States? Even more so than the indigenous people. They were forcibly migrated, and they had to walk miles to get to Oklahoma and whatever. But it's the African people that really bore the brunt of these things, all right? Now, what they did was, a lot of people assume they arrived first in West Africa. Actually, they arrived in North Africa. Now, in North Africa, they have Egypt. It's right at the northern end of Africa. And in Egypt lived the North African Arabs. They're described in the slave manifest as the fair-skinned, curly-haired Africans. Who does that describe? The Arabs that still live in that part of North Africa. Now, these colonizers had ulterior motives from the very beginning. So they started trading with these people. They traded with them items like agates, which are stones, glass beads, manila, cowrie shells, and the like. However, it did not take them long to realize that there was, of course, a form of slavery that was going on in Africa even before they arrived. Because they had other African leaders who were enslaving each other, different factions would fight with each other. The difference is, if you were captured in Africa by another African, you were simply taken to another part of the continent. That was not the same as when the colonizers decided to go in there and slave people. They actually enlisted the Arabs to go into West Africa to capture the big hardy Africans to enslave. And they did something that would change slavery in Africa forever. They gave them guns. Guns did not exist in the African culture before the Europeans introduced it to them. And these Arabs would come at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, shooting off their guns. This was the first time Africans had ever heard gunfire. They were frightened. They would come running out and they would immediately gather them up and start marching them towards the coastline. Now at the time, the Africans were only fighting with spears and bows and arrows. They weren't going to win that fight. I'm sure you've heard the term, you can't take a knife to a gunfight. It certainly held true there, all right? So they would capture these people, all right? Now, at first, many of these African slavers didn't think that they were going to take their people away forever. They thought they were going to take them to another part of the continent. They did. But once they saw them putting their people on boats, they realized they had been lied. They were duped. In much the same way the American Indians were duped. And we know their story, don't we? All right? And they started fighting back. And they fiercely fought back. But they were no competition for Europeans with guns, and now other Africans with guns, and all they had were spears and bows and arrows, all right? Now, they would put these people in what are called dungeons, or some people call them castles. They're actually forts. I call them what they were, dungeons. They were forts, all right? And these people would be marched down from the coastline and put in these forts. Now, these forts lined the whole West African continent. Every European country had their own fort. Now, we're talking, by the way, if you ever had an opportunity to visit Mother Africa, you'll be able to walk through these places. And I will tell you, it is such a life-changing experience. You see things that aren't there, you hear things that aren't there, and the odor is like nothing I've ever experienced. One of the tour guides told me that before they could open it up to the public, they had to excavate 6 feet down to just get down to the bottom because of the dead bodies and the excrement that was left there over the years, all right? So again, if you go there, it is really life-changing experience. I then realized when I left Africa that though I am African, I'm also African-American, all right? It gave meaning to the term African-American, all right? Now, once they did that, these people were held in these forts for weeks and months at a time, waiting for a ship to come. Now, once those ships come, they would take these people and put them on these ships. Now the men were held separately in the hold, H-O-L-D, or the hull, H-U-L-L, in the bottom of the slave ships. And they were laid down on their backs or on their sides. Now, it took 2 to 3 months to get from the shores of Africa into the shores of North America. Now, you can't lay on your back or your side for that long period of time. You know why? Your lungs collapse, you get pneumonia, and you die. And not only that, these ships are made out of wood. Water would seep in. Maybe these men drowned during the transporting, all right? These Europeans realized that they had to get these dead and dying bodies off these ships because they were causing the ship to list. But when they go to pull a body out, an arm would come off, a leg would come off, and they would just throw it overboard. Something started on these slave ships just a few feet below the water. What do you suppose it was? Sharks. You're absolutely right. You may not be aware of this or not, but sharks developed a propensity for eating human flesh during the transatlantic slave trade. Sharks used to stay out to sea like the rest of the other mammals, like the dolphins and the other ones. But today, you hear about sharks that are coming right up to the coastline, and they're biting people. Who are most of the people that they're biting? Yes, the pink people are these people, all right? You know why? Because they're the ones out there on those scuba boards, rafting. You know we ain't into that. What's the lady come to her and say, girl, see here, Jamal got bit by a shark? You ain't never heard that. We ain't into that, all right? I just thought I'd share that with you. But it's true. It's true, all right? So anyway, these people, again, were transported. And when they would put these men on these ships, they would shackle them down with this. This is the middle passage shackle, all right? Now, once this lock is put on, you can't possibly get out of it. These people would be set up in a row. A long chain would go here and collect the whole row of enslaved Africans, all right? Now, if one of them decided to jump overboard, where do you think the rest of them are going? That happened more often than not because people just wanted to stop the oppression. Now, notice the shackle is very mobile. It's constantly moving up and down the outside of the skin. This is on their ankle, by the way, all right? What do you think is happening to the skin? It's breaking open. Now, maggots started living under here. Maggots eat dead skin, all right? And this is what they would put on their wrists. This is a wrist shackle. That's a key to unlock the little linchpin in that shackle. And they shackle their hands in front of them. So the only thing they had available were their fingers. Sometimes, by the way, I forgot to mention to you, once they realized they were losing too many of their human cargo by laying them down on the slave ships, they started sitting the men up, closely cropped between each other's legs. The man in front of you would be so tightly cropped between your legs that the back of his head would be this close to your face, all right? That's how tightly packed they were. And they assumed some might die, but they were hoping enough would still be left over that they could make money off of them, all right? So anyway, as I said, maggots started living under here. Now, maggots eat dead skin. I had one of my visitors tell me that he was a medic in Vietnam, and whenever they would come across a deceased body, they would look at the number of maggots on the body to determine how long that body had been deceased. Sometimes, in these Africans' hunger, they would reach down and grab a handful of maggots and eat them. Now, maggots don't hurt you, I understand. I'm told that it's full of protein. Not to suggest you go home and eat any, but these people were trying to survive. They also started drinking their own urine because they realized that the salty seawater that they were being given was making them sick. I just want you to understand, these people did all they could to survive, and thank God enough of them did, because I wouldn't be here, many of you wouldn't be here either, all right? Now, again, these trips, these slave ships, were just, again, a petri dish. Disease ran rampant. Disease like dysentery. You know what dysentery is? Explosive diarrhea. These people were sitting in 12 to 18 inches of their filth and theirs around them, all right? Again, understand how hard, and it took 2 to 3 months again to get from the shores of Africa into the shores of North America. Now, you may be asking yourself, what about the women? Weren't they captured? Yes, they were captured. However, the King of England had difficulty getting European males to go and work as a crewman on a slave ship. So you know what he did? He went into the prison system, and he offered the prisoners their freedom. He told them that if you go work on a slave ship, you'll receive a bounty at the end of the trip. but while you were on board, you could have access to any of the females. Many of these women were pregnant before they got to their final destination. Enslaved African women suffered horribly on these slave ships. I read in the slave manifest that sometimes, during certain times of the month, when the women were all together, they said that the floorboards of a ship looked like a slaughterhouse. Because you know, when women are put together, our menses correlate, you know? So again, just think about that. Some of those women, like I said, didn't survive. But those that did then auctioned off when they got to the other side, all right? So it's important to recognize this. Now, I don't know if I've run over my time, because I understood only at 20 minutes.
You